What's interesting about my experience with the Titanic was on my first dive, I came in right here.
Hollywood movies. But there's one version of Titanic we have never seen until this morning.
A dying man's words can dismantle the legends we thought were untouchable. In 1985, Robert Ballard became a global hero for finding the Titanic, closing the book on decades of speculation.
This has been my dream, sit in comfort instead of squeezed inside a submarine to see hundreds and hundreds of miles beneath the sea.
For years, the tale stayed polished, and Ballard let the myth breathe. But now, with his health fading and time running thin, he admits the wreck held darker truths: greed, arrogance, and perhaps conspiracy. Stay with us, because his confession threatens to rewrite history itself. The man chasing ghosts beneath the waves. For 4 decades, Robert Ballard stayed silent about something he noticed at the Titanic's wreck, something that troubled him far more than the famous bow or the scattered relics.
That not only gave them the legal right to go back and recover things, it obligated them to go back and recover things.
The secret had roots in his lifelong obsession with the ocean, an obsession that started in the unlikeliest of places. Ballard grew up in Kansas during the 1940s, surrounded by flat farmland with no ocean in sight. As a boy, he was fond of old science fiction movies about submarines and dreamed of exploring the ocean himself. His father, a geography professor with a love of travel, eventually sent him to ocean camps on the coast. There, Ballard saw real divers and crewed early submersibles, experiences that cemented his fascination with what lay beneath the waves.
This has been my dream, sit in comfort instead of squeezed inside a submarine to see hundreds and hundreds of miles beneath the sea.
That fascination followed him into the United States Navy in the early 1960s, at the height of the Cold War. While many of his fellow officers focused on chasing Soviet submarines, Ballard's mind stayed fixed on the unknown deep. He trained in sonar and submarine navigation, but kept sketching designs for unmanned vehicles that could survive depths where human divers would be crushed. Some in the Navy saw him as a dreamer, but they also recognized his value. His ideas could push undersea technology forward.
Forward, wide.
By the 1970s, Ballard was working at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, building the first remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs. These tethered robots carried cameras and lights into places no diver could reach. Early critics doubted them, but Ballard's persistence paid off when his machines captured the first images of hydrothermal vents on the seafloor, living ecosystems thriving in complete darkness. That breakthrough convinced him that he was ready for an even bigger challenge: finding the Titanic. The liner's story was already infamous. Launched in 1912 as the largest ship of its day, she was declared unsinkable.
The largest moving object ever made by the hand of man in all history.
But on her first voyage from Southampton, she struck an iceberg on the night of 14th April. Within hours, she was gone, taking more than 1,500 lives with her. Over the decades, the tragedy had been idealized and the causes simplified. Ballard believed the truth had been buried with the ship, and he wanted to uncover it. In 1985, working with the Navy, Ballard led an expedition using his new ROV technology. After weeks of searching the North Atlantic, the image finally appeared on his screen in the early hours of the 1st September, the Titanic's bow, twisted and half buried in silt. But that first look wasn't the solemn ruin the world expected. What Ballard saw raised questions he would wrestle with for decades, questions he would not fully answer until much later in his life. But when Ballard finally saw what lay beneath the waves, the first truth he uncovered was not what the world expected. It exposed a lie that had shaped the Titanic's story for more than 70 years. The lie that hid the Titanic's true end.
I didn't get to spend much time on the Titanic, but when we went back in 2004 with Hercules, we were able to spend days.
The first lie that Robert Ballard's cameras brought to light wasn't about treasure or secret cargo. It was about the sinking itself. For more than 70 years, the world believed the Titanic had slipped beneath the Atlantic in one piece, a tragic but almost noble end. That story came from the White Star Line itself. Within days of the sinking in April 1912, as 705 survivors stepped off the Carpathia in New York.
Goodbye, I'll miss you! Goodbye!
The company's chairman, Bruce Ismay, who had escaped in a lifeboat, pushed a version of events that cast the disaster as an unavoidable act of nature. He claimed the ship went down intact, lights still glowing, sparing the company deeper blame for ignored iceberg warnings, excessive speed, too few lifeboats, and weak bulkhead designs. Both the British and American inquiries accepted much of this version, allowing the company to limit payouts to a mere $7,000 per victim. The lie stuck because it was easier to believe in fate than in negligence. By the early 1980s, as Robert Ballard prepared to find the wreck, he studied the original inquiry records and survivor testimonies. The inconsistencies were glaring.
We will finalize the Nautilus's schedule, but where we actually go, we don't know yet, but we're going to figure that out shortly.
If the ship had gone down in one piece, the wreck would lie together on the seafloor. If it had broken apart, it meant decades of official history had been built on a cover-up. In the early hours of 1 September 1985, Ballard's team aboard the research vessel Cunard lowered the Argo sled more than 2.5 miles into the North Atlantic. In the control van, they stared at the live feed as the cameras descended into darkness, the pressure outside enough to crush steel in seconds. At first, only drifting sediment appeared. Then, out of the gloom, the bow of the Titanic. But it was not intact. The forward hull was ripped open, edges twisted and jagged. Rusticles, reddish clusters of iron-eating microbes, hung from the decks like wet stalactites. Railings were bent inward. Nearby lay fragments of lives cut short, a cracked teacup, a briefcase, broken brass fittings. Then came the revelation that rewrote history. The stern was nowhere near the bow, scattered across a wide scrap field. The ship had torn itself apart as it sank.
In this deep-sea tomb, the most common items take on uncommon significance.
That single fact exposed the decades-old myth as a fabrication and revealed that critical design flaws and fatal decisions had been hidden with the dead. Ballard had not just found a wreck. He had uncovered the proof that the Titanic's final moments were far more violent and far less forgivable than the world had been led to believe. Yet even that revelation was only the beginning. The wreck would soon reveal how the ship actually came apart, a brutal, hidden fracture that doomed her from the start. The break that sealed Titanic's fate. The discovery that shook Ballard most wasn't where the Titanic lay, but how she had gone down. The wreck revealed a truth long buried. The ship had not slipped beneath the waves whole, but had torn itself apart as it sank, an unseen catastrophe that exposed the fatal flaws hidden in her design. The Argo's cameras crept over a slope of debris and then stopped. The Titanic's bow and stern were not together. They were half a mile apart with a trail of wreckage between them. The forward section rested upright in the silt, its bow buried at an angle, but the stern had slammed down upside down, its 3 giant propellers pointing toward the surface like clawed fingers reaching for help that never came. This was not the graceful, single plunge survivors had described in 1912. Something catastrophic had happened as the ship sank.
Nearly 2,300 feet across the wreck site, the experts have spotted a clue.
Ballard's crew stared at the monitors as the sonar confirmed the split, a long, torn gap between the two halves of the ship. But that wasn't all. As the cameras moved slowly through the field of debris, huge steel boilers, each weighing about 20 tons, had been hurled from the ship's interior and now lay toppled on the seabed, their fireboxes split open. Pipes, copper tubing, and crushed galleyware lay tangled among them. Nearby, the skeletal davits, the very cranes that once held the lifeboats, now hung rust-stained.
This is what's left of the heart of Titanic. Generated in these boilers is providing the power and the light to the ship.
The images further confirmed Ballard's suspicion that the Titanic had not sunk intact. She had broken apart under the stress of her descent, probably about 1,000 feet down, when trapped air pockets in the stern caused it to rise and twist as the bow pulled down. The hull could not take the opposing forces. It tore near the expansion joint, a section designed to flex with the ocean's swells, but never tested for such strain. But here is where it gets even worse. As the cameras zoomed in, the evidence of structural failure became clear.
It's Murdoch Station, right? Yes, it was. And you'll notice here that davit is in the upright or retracted position.
Rows of rivets had popped loose along the tier, their heads bent outward, a sign the metal had failed under stress. Later lab studies confirmed it. The iron used in many of the rivets was brittle, weakened by impurities from rushed manufacturing. Under the freezing Atlantic pressure, it cracked rather than held. For Ballard and his team, the revelation was sobering. Titanic's end had not been simply the work of an iceberg. It had been hastened by human choices, cheaper materials, rushed construction, and misplaced confidence. But the steel and rivets told only part of the story. The next discovery lay scattered across the seabed itself, silent witnesses that showed not just how the ship broke, but how human decisions may have sealed the fate of hundreds.
think I'd revise that. I'd say that the steel probably tells more complicated stories than we can tell from how it's lying on the bottom of the ocean.
The silent witnesses. Another discovery that rewrote Titanic's story didn't come from survivors or old records. It came from the wreckage itself. What Ballard's team saw on the seabed wasn't just debris. It exposed how the ship really went down, shattering decades of accepted history and revealing failures long buried beneath the waves. As the Argo's camera drifted slowly beyond the debris field, its beam cutting through the silt, the first shapes to emerge weren't pieces of the ship, but shoes. Dozens of them, sitting in pairs on the ocean floor. The leather had outlasted the bodies that once filled them, the rest long dissolved in the cold Atlantic. They looked as if their owners had stepped out for only a moment and might return.
These all tell a story. It's vital that we listen to the stories that the wreck can tell.
The sight was so unsettling that Ballard ordered the pilots to ease the sled's movement. He stared at the screen as the camera closed in on a cluster near what had been the grand staircase. A man's scuffed Oxfords lay beside a woman's button-up boots. One heel snapped off as if in a desperate rush. Just inches away sat a tiny child's shoe, half buried in silt. Surprisingly, there are no skeletal remains. The human imprint changed the tone on the control deck. To him, the scene was not just haunting, it was evidence. Evidence of choices made on that April night in 1912. He thought of the locked gates that kept steerage passengers from reaching the lifeboats, of lifeboats lowered half empty, of the wireless operators who ignored ice warnings to send trivial messages. Moving farther along the starboard wreckage, the cameras caught more details that challenged long-held assumptions. For decades, the story had been that a massive gash had ripped open the Titanic's side. But what appeared in the lights was a series of small, narrow fractures, each only about a foot long, where riveted plates had popped apart under pressure. These seams had allowed water to rush in fast enough to swamp the pump room in minutes. It was not a single heroic wound. It was the failure of rushed shipyard work, corners cut to meet deadlines. As the sled passed over scattered personal items, a crushed sextant, a shattered chronometer, a leather valise with initials barely visible, the picture grew clearer. The Titanic's tragedy had not been inevitable. It had been engineered by decisions made far from the icy Atlantic. The warnings that went unheard. Amid the wreckage, Ballard's team found something that rewrote the timeline of Titanic's last night.
Oh, look at that.
Some more stuff coming. That is big.
Good look at it.
A tangled mass of wireless cables, fused and broken, the silent remains of messages that might have saved her. As the Argo's lights swept across the seabed, the cameras locked onto a jumble of torn cables spilling from what had been the wireless room. They looked like veins ripped from the ship itself, a reminder that warnings had once pulsed through them, warnings that never reached the captain in time. The sled drifted past the collapsed bulkhead of the Marconi room, the very place where operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride had sat through the night of April 14th, 1912. Ballard knew their story well. Two men manning the brass telegraph keys, struggling to keep up with a flood of paid passenger messages, while ice reports were pushed aside. The equipment, now little more than rusted frames and warped antenna stubs, seemed to reach upward, as if still trying to send a signal through the dark water. The story the wreckage told was damning. Hours before the collision, ships in the same shipping lanes, the Rappahannock at midday, the Athenia later in the afternoon, reported heavy pack ice ahead. By evening, the Mesaba transmitted a direct warning that the ice field at 42 degrees north was dense and unavoidable. Yet Titanic's radio operators, buried under stacks of personal messages for wealthy passengers, never relayed the warning to the bridge. Ballard's team scanned further, capturing the cables sprawled like frozen rivers leading away from the site. They knew the most tragic warning came from the Californian, just 10 miles away. Her crew had stopped for the night amid ice and signaled Titanic to slow down.
Is there anyone there?
Yes, what you see?
Iceberg, right ahead.
Thank you.
Phillips, overwhelmed and irritated, told them to keep out, busy sending. That decision sealed the ship's fate. Minutes later, the Titanic's bow tore into the iceberg. The images of the twisted davits, the cradles that once held the lifeboats, made the discovery even grimmer. White Star Line had equipped the Titanic with lifeboats for barely half of those aboard, prioritizing deck space and aesthetics over safety. When the ship struck the iceberg, there were never enough lifeboats to save everyone, no matter how quickly they launched them. But the tragedy on that frozen night was not the only secret the deep was keeping. Before Ballard ever revealed the wreck to the world, he had already been sent on a very different mission, one that would shape everything he was allowed to say. The secret mission beneath the Titanic. Before Robert Ballard ever laid eyes on the Titanic's bow in 1985, he had already seen something far more guarded, a pair of nuclear submarines lost during the Cold War. That classified mission, hidden behind the Titanic expedition, would shape everything he could and could not say about what he found on the ocean floor. The Navy's funding for Ballard's expedition was not a simple grant. It came with conditions. Ballard had to agree to use his new deep-sea camera systems to first locate and survey the wrecks of two lost U.S. submarines, the USS Thresher and USS Scorpion, both of which had sunk in the 1960s with nuclear reactors still on board.
I've explored the Thresher and the Scorpion, which were two U.S. submarines. In the case of the Scorpion,
the Titanic search was the public face. The true priority was checking the state of those subs before the Soviets could. To the world, Ballard and his team from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution were preparing for an ambitious search for the legendary liner. But on the research vessel Nor, maps were marked with secret coordinates. The crew logged Titanic transects, yet their submersibles made long detours to the Thresher's resting place at about 41 degrees 33 minutes north and a canyon wall depth that nearly crushed it. They quietly recorded sonar scans and radiation readings, relaying the data home through encrypted bursts sent from ocean buoys, so brief and scattered that Soviet surveillance could not trace them. Only after the Navy's objectives were met did Ballard turn his focus to the Titanic. By then, whispers had begun to circulate. Some crewmen claimed to have seen sealed crates loaded at night onto helicopters. Others suspected that more than just relics of a passenger ship had been recovered from the seabed. The secrecy only deepened the controversies that followed. Some researchers pointed to gaps in the official expedition log, 3 full days unaccounted for, and to missing footage of certain hull sections. Conspiracy theories grew that Ballard's mission had uncovered evidence of something darker, perhaps even hints that the ship resting on the seabed might not have been the Titanic at all, but her nearly identical sister ship, the Olympic. Ballard himself never confirmed such claims, dismissing the missing data as technical delays. Yet the questions lingered. If the Navy had controlled the expedition's priorities, could they have also shaped the story the world was allowed to hear? For some, the idea that Ballard may have carried that knowledge in silence for decades makes his late-life reflections far more unsettling. And it was not the only secret he carried. Even the images that first stunned the world were not the whole truth. Some were carefully edited, hiding evidence that could have rewritten history. The truth they didn't want Ballard to tell. For decades, Robert Ballard hinted that what he saw at the wreck was not exactly what the public was shown. He once admitted in private that the first images of the Titanic were carefully edited before the world ever saw them. Why? Because some of what his cameras captured could have changed the entire story of the disaster and reopened legal and political wounds many wanted left buried.
well, you know, again, as you know, I was opposed to taking anything from the Titanic.
When Ballard finally located the wreck on September 2nd, 1985, headlines around the world focused on the Titanic's bow, standing upright like a monument on the seabed. But the stern, which lay almost 2,000 feet away, was shown only in a few blurry photos. The official explanation was that it had drifted during the sinking. Yet Ballard later suggested the raw footage told a more drastic story, evidence of structural failure that could have shifted the blame from the iceberg to how the ship was built. That detail mattered. If the public saw that the Titanic had literally broken apart because of weak steel or flawed design, it could have reignited lawsuits against the long-gone White Star Line and even against shipbuilders whose successors were still in business. The companies that had profited from the Titanic's legend had no interest in reviving that fight. Keeping the focus on a tragic but inevitable accident was safer and more profitable. Whispers of hidden discoveries went beyond shipbuilding flaws. A declassified memo from the 1990s described a sealed trunk recovered from the wreck and quietly shipped to a secure facility in Virginia. What it held remains unknown. Ballard denied the wilder theories that it contained secret weapons research or sensitive financial records, but he never fully explained why it was taken without public notice. Those late-life reflections have led many to wonder what Ballard will finally reveal. Did he hold back the full truth to protect reputations, or was he forced to? And if the first expedition's footage was edited to hide critical evidence, what else might still be locked away, waiting for the world to learn before the man who found the Titanic is gone? Ballard's final revelation. Recently, as Robert Ballard's health began to fail, he started telling a very different story about what he had really found at the bottom of the North Atlantic.
What's interesting about my experience with the Titanic was on my first dive, I came in right here.
In hushed conversations with colleagues, he admitted the wreck did not just reveal a tragic accident, it revealed a deliberate cover-up that had been hiding in plain sight for more than a century. Ballard explained that the truth had been visible in the wreck all along. The scattered debris field, stretching more than 600 yards, showed that the ship hadn't slipped under in one piece, as survivors once believed. The bow had plunged forward, dragging the stern until the hull snapped apart under violent opposing forces. This pattern of rupture, Ballard said, was not only the result of the iceberg strike, but also of flawed construction.
Found this very interesting. It's a steam valve. It didn't come from here. It landed on the wreck after the stern had...
The steel plates and rivets, he claimed, were cheaper substitutes rushed into the ship's build. In the freezing Atlantic, they shattered like brittle glass. The wreck itself bore silent testimony. A new full-hull scan revealed the concave shape of some of the great steel boilers, a sign that they were still under pressure as they plunged into the depths. Lying on the stern's exposed deck, a valve was found locked in the open position, proof that steam was still being forced through the power lines to the generators. Nearby, the scan captured the layout of a boiler room almost intact, confirming eyewitness accounts that engineers kept the lights burning as the ship's death throes unfolded. Those men, led by Chief Engineer Joseph Bell, stayed behind, feeding coal into the furnaces to buy passengers a few more minutes of light and hope. A computer simulation deepened the puzzle. It showed that Titanic might have been doomed not by a gaping wound, but by a chain of small ruptures, some no larger than an A4 sheet of paper, where the brittle hull plates split under the stress of the collision. Seawater pouring in through those hidden seams sealed the liner's fate long before the stern rose into the air. For Ballard, these details confirmed what he had long suspected. The disaster was not simply nature's work. It was driven by human ambition and corner-cutting, cheaper steel, fewer lifeboats to preserve first-class promenades, and a reckless push for speed to outshine rivals. As his voice weakened, he issued one last warning. If you call it an accident, you let them off the hook. This was built to fail, and people died for it. Ballard's final words left the room silent, not just a historian's judgment, but a dying man's accusation. The question now passes to us. Should we confront the truth, or should we let it slide, just as so many did in 1912? Share your answer in the comments section below, and if you want to uncover more stories where history's legends are stripped bare, subscribe and join us as we dig deeper into the truths the past tried to bury. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.